Well, my full name is Marion Elizabeth Chitty Harvey Stark. The Marion in my name is for an aunt, my father's sister, who lived in Gay, a maiden aunt, a spinster, and that I would often visit. She had a wonderful sense of humor, funny as a crutch. Her name was Isabel, and Marion Isabel, and it's spelled with an M-A-R-I-O-N, like Marion County in the state of Florida. Then Elizabeth is for my mother's only sister, and she ended up living in Winter Park, Florida. Had her family down there, but we were very close, visited back and forth. She had children about the same age that we were. And then the Chitty is the family name. The Harvey was my first husband, Earl Harvey, and Stark was my second husband. And they were best friends, believe it or not. That's an interesting story, but I won't go into that. I don't know actually, but I have heard that I was born in where my parents lived at that time, which was in Springfield on 4th Street, near Pearl Street. Now, Dolly can identify the place. I cannot. I must confess that I've always been more interested in the now and the future, what is to come. So I have never been a buff for roots and genealogy and stuff, and we've got a huge family, and I always felt it was just too much for me to do that. I was born December the 31st, 1916, about 30 minutes before midnight. But it was in the days before all the wonderful excitement about New Year's babies, so there was very little excitement, I think, with my birth. It was just probably a relief for Mama. But I was the third in the family, and I had an older brother and an older sister, both of whom were very smart. So here old straggly me, I was kind of sickly. I was small. My first nicknames were Teeny and Tiny, depending on who was calling me. But I didn't like either one of them, so I finally, I wanted to be called Marion. And my older sister said, you cannot be Marion because my name is Mary Ann, and I want to use my full name, so you'll just have to be Elizabeth. And I said, well, then I'll be Betty. I chose the nickname, the easy way out, easy to spell too. I was, I guess, 4 or 5 years old, preschool age, because I wanted to enter school, with that name. I guess that's sort of the very beginning. There were 6 of us, and there were really 2 sets of children. My older brother, my older sister, and myself, and then there's a little waiting period. And then there were 3 younger ones to kind of help understand the difference. The 3 older ones went through a tragic mourning period with my father after Mama died, and the Depression came together, which was pretty horrible. And then the 3 younger ones down the road, things had gotten better, and the older ones had left home. And so Billy, Dolly, and Gertrude were really kind of raised as grandchildren. Daddy was able to indulge them. He had softened and didn't feel the heavy responsibility that he originally did when there were 6 of us and 4 girls. So you can imagine from a mourning father, daddy, what he must have went through. And he was very strict, had to be, I'm sure. And it was not until I was grown, married with children, that I realized all of his wonderful qualities, which we felt were tough, too disciplined, and all those things. But I realized the necessity because I had two daughters, two little girls, and then a son. I realized what a remarkable man my father was. But it took aging for me. But I never confronted him. I was always a little afraid of him. My older sister locked horns with him, and they were constantly disagreeing on things, and which kept a little undercurrent. But I was a peacemaker. I liked things even and on the quiet side. And so I never really argued with my older sister, and certainly didn't argue or question Daddy. I wasn't equipped to do that. My father, even though he was strict, he enjoyed he enjoyed his family, having children, and feeling like he was a good provider for them. It gave him great pleasure. Her name was Hazel Talitha Brown Chitty. And Talitha is from the Bible, and I have found it in the Bible. I don't know where Hazel came from. I have really tried to find out. I have no idea. Never had any clues. She was stately, dignified, stately, feminine. Everybody loved her. She had a wonderful personality and disposition. Now, of course, I think of her mostly in wraparound dresses because so much of the time she was pregnant, and that's the way you dressed. She loved blue. She had copper-colored hair. In the sun, it was just ablaze, red, golden red, not heavy red, but on the golden side, and had long hair most of her life. She did have to cut her hair, which was a terrible thing. When she was very ill, the doctors suggested that the long hair was drawing her strength. Whether it does or not, it's probably an old wives' tale, but that's what, so she cut her hair. We all hated to see that. My mental picture of my mother is sitting in a rocking chair. There were a pair of mahogany rocking chairs in the front bedroom, and she kept them on either side of the fireplace. And of course, we had 4 fireplaces in the house, and there was one in the big bedroom where we spent a great deal of time. And she would sit there and be rocking one of the babies, and it was a beautiful maternal scene that we lived with. My father adored my mother. And after she died, he never looked at another woman. He would get calls, and his friends would try to include him in dinner parties, things like that. He had no interest in it. His comfort in this tragedy was being home and having us around him. And he was not a lovable man, but he gave us security. He was referred to as the Rock of Gibraltar. And of course, that's kind of what the house was called as well, because it was sturdily built, and it was a homestead, and that's, I mean, in the true sense of the word. My mother loved, she wanted to please Daddy, and she did to perfection. She was not a cook. She ran a rather efficient household. We always had servants, and good, dependable servants. And she managed well, and the only things I remember my mother preparing, she did eggnog for Daddy, and we had it on his birthday and for Christmas. And that's when we pulled out the bottle of bourbon and added the jigger or 2 jiggers to cook 12 eggs, is what they call, when you add the whiskey, it cooks the eggs, according to the way they talk about the recipe. She would make pound cakes. He loved pound cake, and of course butter and anything that you cooked from scratch. It was wonderful, and you used you know, good butter, and we'd go to the country and get fresh eggs right out to the country, and go to a lot of trouble for good food. And of course, my father, being in the wholesale grocery business, there was never any question that we didn't have a great abundance. We had lots of company. People loved to come to our house. It was always exciting. There were so many of us. Good food. And so much of our happiness and social life were when we were seated around the table. And we would often have 12 or 15 people, you know, move in, and I don't remember. There were extra leaves for the table. I don't remember too much going through the process. It seemed to just stay big all the time. I guess the sweet and very intimate thing that I think about on Sunday, the sleeping pattern with the girls were in the dormitory, and that was the big bedroom, and there was 3 very pretty mahogany beds, a full-size bed, which was called a double, but it was big, and then twin beds, so that's where the girls were. And my mother would sleep in the big bed. The babies slept in what was called a kitty coop, and it was a bed frame, but it had wire and a cover on it, so you could cover the top. And because there was a problem with mosquitoes, and the house was opened up, and even though you have screens and all, they felt that was a protection for the baby. But on Sunday morning, we'd look for Mama, and she wouldn't be in the big bedroom where she was supposed to be with us. And so I'd go looking for her, and she would be on the sleeping porch in this little 3/4 bed with Daddy. And I never quite understood until I got grown that that was their time together. I mean, he was with the boys, and she was with us. And our house was so arranged that you could go from the big bedroom at the top of the steps, room to room, around the hall to the blue room, which was the girls' room, which we later went to. And you'd have this pattern of checking on everybody without ever going out into the hall. My mother had some funny fears, and I think it was probably the generation that she was raised in. But she was afraid of storms, very much afraid of lightning and thunder. Now, whether she had been in, of course, she was raised in Oklahoma, and maybe their storms are more frightening. I don't know. But she did have a fear, and when we'd have severe storms, which of course Florida does have, we would go into one of the middle bedrooms around the hall from the big bedroom. And there was a feather bed in there. It was a wooden frame bed, and it had a feather mattress. It was wonderful. It's like sleeping in a down comfort. And we'd all pile on that bed with Mama and wait the storm out. And she would never let us be anywhere near a fireplace because they thought, the thinking at the time was that the lightning could come down and could strike you if you were sitting in front of the fireplace. So these things are probably, so different from our world now, but it's what we lived with. Well, I've probably said a good bit about my older sister, and she had a dominant personality. She loved to tell ghost stories, loved to scare people. She had very strong likes and dislikes. And I feel like I spent a lot of my young life, but never opposing her, I guess is the best way to say it. It was not worth it to me, and I wasn't equal to it. But both my brother, older brother, and sister were really brilliant. My brother, Arthur Jr., which we always called him later on down the road, we called him Artie. They were both excellent students, and the teachers would always expect me to be smart and be able to draw like Mamie could. Of course, I never had any trouble passing my subjects and made pretty good grades, but I did not excel. They both did. Let me see now, my brother. He was, I guess I can use the word, on the wild side. That's a little strong, and it's not comparable what today it means in today. But for that time, we considered Artie pretty wild. We knew that when he went out that he would drink, that this was high school, getting into high school and college. And all of his friends loved to come to the house, and they were very nice to us. Of course, we kept our ground because we thought they were too wild for us to date. Well, Billy was a mischievous little boy, and he loved to, he was Daddy's favorite, and very cute little boy, so he got by with murder and all the things that Arthur Jr., the older son, couldn't possibly get by with. And very good looking, and of course became a womanizer up down the road when the war came in. He was a bomber pilot and was in the Pacific Theater, had a very illustrious career, and wanted to stay in the service, and Daddy said he had to come back to grocery business, which was a terrible mistake because he didn't. He just started drinking or continued to drink and became his downfall. He is the tragedy of the six. Dolly was very lovable, everybody. She was easy to be around and always wanted, included with the older brothers and sisters. And then Gertrude, my joy in life, little rascal, Duchess of Willow Branch, that Daddy named her. Willow Branch was the park down, next to us, Willow Branch Park. Well, I was about 13, 12 or 13 when Mama died. Well, I guess, yeah, about 12. And then Gertrude was a little over a year when Mama died. Mm-hmm. But she was just a cute little, tow-headed, always tiny, and sickly, really. She was just special, and I always felt like she was my first child because I had strong maternal feelings toward Gertrude. And when she was growing up, and of course I liked doing family things and taking a role. It was no problem for me to take a role as an older woman, or I guess I'd say a younger woman, because I'd go to PTA meetings and sign in because their class would get money if they, had parents come. I mean, $1 for a head or something. And I learned to sew, and I'd make her costumes. And Gertrude and I have always had a very strong feeling for each other, and now she's just so wonderful because she accepts me in the aging process. I hesitate to say this, but know how to take care of me, or so obviously want to take care of me, Gertrude and this grandson, Matthew Miller, that I helped raise. And he comes by my house still several times a week. And he comes and he wants to put out the garbage for me and help me do anything that needs doing. Well, Gertrude's like that. She loves doing anything when she's around me. We made our own entertainment. We made our own fun. We were musically inclined. And of course, we'll all learn to dance, except my older sister, which just looked down on now she liked to be a part of the singing, but she looked down on dance. She wouldn't learn to drive, and didn't until she got a job and had to manage her to get around. But we had, and we walked everywhere, to visit people, and except when we were little, we had a chauffeur. But I mean, later on, you know, we didn't all have cars, is what I'm driving at. There was a big family car, which I drove from the time I was 12 years old. And it was a 7-passenger Lincoln. It took a car that big because we did Sunday drives. Daddy rarely drove, and we were scared to death if he ever sat at the wheel because he was a miserable driver. So as soon as Arthur Jr. or I could, or Uncle Will, and then Hunky, and originally Dan, the colored man, that sort of took care of the chauffeur part. Our socializing really was at home, eating and cutting up. And of course we had a Victrola, and so we had music. We had a piano, and we went with, I went with one boy that was a wonderful musician, could play anything, you know, by it. And so he was a very special person in our social life. And, but we had interesting friends, and very varied. They loved to come to our house. And so very often the visiting was done at home, the friendships. Sitting on the porch, often the men, because they would smoke cigars. And Daddy I never saw Daddy smoke a cigarette. And of course the women would be with Mama, either downstairs or usually upstairs in the big bedroom. They always loved to be up there in the rocking chairs, around the chair, and we would just spread out all around them. One of our girlfriends who had a strong crush on Arthur Jr. and Arthur Jr. on her, it was Mary Martha. Her mother didn't think we were socially acceptable. We were grocerymen children. And the fact that we lived in a nice home and, you know, we were presentable wasn't quite enough for Mrs. Klein. And I'll bring her up a little bit later. But she was a lovely, lovely lady. And of course she had, you know, her friends were the social and the rich and the social. So of course we weren't of that caliber. But her daughter used to sneak away and come down and see us. And when the mother would call the house to find out, Mary Martha would run outside so we could honestly say, we didn't want to ever get caught in a lie, we could honestly say, she's not here with us. Mary Martha would be on the premises, but she would not be there with us. So Mary Martha, when she could drive, she would drive their big, and I think it was a Packard, it seems, a big yellow Packard, a beige Packard, it's a big car. And she would come and park her car in the alley, her mother's car, in the alley. So in case anybody should ride by and see that car, it was very distinctive. They would know that Mary Martha, and they would probably report it to Miss Klein. So that was an interesting, sort of a mysterious, and we loved those. We love those kind of games. But we never got caught in them. Then we had another friend that lived up the alley. We'd go up the alley to visit Harriet Friels. Her mother, I mean, their home was lovely. It was beautiful red brick and Williamsburg style, elegant in the neighborhood, still is lovely. And they had an attic with steps going up the attic. And for some reason, there was a stage in the attic. And we were very close friends to Harriet, and she loved to visit us. And in return, her mother would invite us. And so as a result, we would, you know, get rid of our ideas of theater work, being on the stage. It was all so easy for us. And many times, you know, we would give plays and stuff, and we would charge a nickel a person to come in. We would charge them when they came. You know, the neighborhood would come in, a nickel a piece. We'd have chairs set up and do these plays. And Mamie, Mary Ann, my older sister, would always write the plays. And in one that was, one of the plays that was so well received, it was a mystery, and we had a trap door set up in the part of the props. So someone was, a hand came out in the trap door and was murdered somebody. It was, one of those wonderful killers. And when they, of course, she wrote it, directed, and designated who was to do what. And the only thing we never quite agreed with her on, she had Mary Martha, who was the only bosomy one in the crowd at that time, and that had to be the man because she was tall enough. So we all had a terrible time trying to dress Mary Martha so that her femininity didn't show, but the play was a huge success. We kept a copy of it for many years, but that was one of those fun things we did. Well, back in those days, you did things on the inexpensive side. And so crepe paper was very easy to come by. It came in big sheets. And so very often these costumes were made out of crepe paper. And it turned out surprisingly well. But, I can't describe other than just saying that's the way, because you didn't want to invest a lot in things like that just for. I remember Miss Boggs, Harriet's mother, had an old, she called them portieres, huge velvet curtains. I don't know why she has them or where they were, but she had the houseman hang the curtain. So we had this dramatic thing. But we made, or assembled the props. But we were very imaginative. Our world was full of imagination. And so we just, and that was our entertainment. We made our own entertainment. Now, of course, we were outside, and as Gertrude was talking about her skating up and down the hill, and we had bicycles, but not toys like today's world. We shared. If we had a bicycle, whether it was a boy's bicycle or a girl's bicycle, we all rode it. And we would carpool, what you call now carpooling. If somebody had a car, they'd come pick up the group, and we'd all go to the drugstore or the ice cream parlor. We'd go in a group, taking care of each other. And so we sort of traveled in little bunches. Mary Virginia Wine Noble. And she lived exactly one block up Riverside Avenue. And we always say up because it was up a slight hill. In a lovely, an interesting family-style home, beautifully furnished. And Ms. Noble encouraged our friendship, just like Ms. Boggs did. That's why we couldn't understand why Ms. Klein didn't think we were wonderful, friends for Mary Martha. But anyway, that's another story. I was devoted to Mary, and Ms. Noble was so good to us, and she would often invite me to come spend the night with Mary on weekends, and she'd let us do interesting ththings, like we loved to go crawl out. The upstairs bathroom had a door, and it opened onto just an open porch. It was really a rooftop. And as I recall it, I don't think it even had a banister around it, but anyway, it was sizable because it was the roof of the downstairs porch. And she would let us take sleeping bags or comforts and make pallets out there, and we would sleep. Well, I had the charge of Dolly. I babysat a lot with Dolly, and then later with Gertrude, because I was more domestically inclined. Mamie didn't like she was an artist, and she was drawing and making paper dolls and all, for us, and would sell them to me and to the neighbors. And so she was otherwise occupied. But anyway, I very often had the babysitting job with Dolly. So I would very often ask if I could bring Dolly when I spent the night with the Nobles. And of course they would always say, yes, Dolly was easy and sweet and lovable, and you know. So Mary and I played Mama and Daddy a lot, and so this was our baby, this was our child. But so Dolly was very often in on the overnights, which Dolly apparently remembers. The Nobles invited me, and I asked Daddy if I could go with them on their vacation to North Carolina. And they invited me several times, and Daddy would never let me go, and I never understood why, because later on, you know, he was so free and accept the fact that we weren't there under the, you know, or within a block. And it was the type of, I guess, security that Daddy needed. Know we were all right. Mm-hmm. But anyway, Governor Martin, of course, he was probably Daddy's closest friend, John Welborn Martin. He was, I don't remember when he was mayor of Jacksonville, but he was. And my father was very instrumental in the political world and helped John get elected and so on and so forth. So they were very, very strong friends, Mr. and Ms. Martin. And then he became governor of Florida. And that was another story where he invited us, and we were invited as a family to visit the governor's mansion in Tallahassee. Magnificent place. And it was really a highlight in our growing up life. We have a picture on the steps of the mansion. And it was before Gertrude was born, so there were 5 siblings. It remained very strong until Mr. Martin died, and they saw a great deal of each other. After he was governor, they did stay on and live in Tallahassee, but my father and John Martin still kept in very close touch regardless. Of course, they had business. He had business back and forth in Jacksonville. Ms. Martin was very good to me, and she taught me social graces. And by that I meant entertaining at home. And I see she would have been the governor's wife. And of course she was a lovely hostess, even, you know, the mayor's wife. And a great deal of responsibility, personal responsibility then, was up to the wife. And she was, you know, and so she was a very pretty woman. And she fit the bill perfectly. She was just what a mayor or a governor needed for a good, attractive wife. And I know later on down the road when my friends were getting married and engaged on, and Daddy would let us, you know, let me give a party there at the house. I remember the first time he okayed me giving a cocktail party, which was a real plum in my life. Ms. Martin loaned me all of her beautiful big silver dishes and trays and all, and helped me set up the table and told me, you know, how to have the flowers, the height. She set a magnificent table. The other, probably next closest friend to my father's was Leon Cheek of Cheek Neal Coffee Company, and it was Maxwell House Coffee Company from Nashville, Tennessee originally, that became, was bought by General Foods. So of course they became very wealthy. They were probably at one time he was probably one of the wealthiest people in the area. But they still, and built a gorgeous castle, English castle, Tudor style on the river. And, but they remained very good friends, and they would come down, and we called her Auntie Cheek. She was a big woman, and he was a small man. Auntie Cheek was his second wife, which was unusual, and had been his secretary. But she was a wonderful woman. Dolly was named for her. Her name was Margaret, and Dolly was named for Auntie Cheek, and of course was a favorite with Auntie Cheek. And the other couple were Mr. and Mrs. Hagan, and he was in the hotel food business and was a competitor of my father's, but they were very which I think is rather unusual. And they were childless. Miss Hagan was redheaded and had a wonderful laugh. She laughed a lot. And she would, and all these couples would continue to come visit us and really, in their way, help Daddy raise us. They cared. And of course, we were brought up to please Daddy and to please, be acceptable for his friends. You know, run an orderly. So we had restrictions like that just sort of built in. Probably at least the last probably 2.5 or 3 years of her life, I realized she was sickly and had to have attention. She was in bed a lot. And I didn't quite understand. Of course, she had surgery. And so, you know, we'd tiptoe around in her room. We'd keep the curtains down because the light would bother her. And we continued to sleep in the room. Although by that time, I mean, somewhere along in there, Mamie and I would stay in what we call the girls' room, which was across the hall, had twin beds, and it was the blue room because it was painted blue and had blue furniture, painted furniture. Well, we loved Mama, and we'd do anything we knew to do, you know, bring her a flower out of the yard, or just like children would do to someone they love. But I remember probably the last 2 years, 1.5 or 2 years of Mama's life, I was aware that she was pretty sick. And people, you know, would come and inquire about her, and sometimes I'd get them mad because they'd come at a time and they'd want to see Mama, and Mama wouldn't feel like seeing them. But you've been to, everybody that's had illness in the family has gone through some, and you know, the expression is kill them with kindness. You know, they'd come out of kindness, but they'd stay too long. And I remember trying to police things like that as a child without hurting anybody's feelings or upsetting Mama. And these are the kind of things that really mark you for the rest of your life, or they have me, things like that. Well, she died when she got very ill. This great uncle of ours, Major Harsh, and she may already be in there, that Dolly had the strongest connection with because they loved Dolly and would invite Dolly to travel with them, which Daddy allowed. But he was a quack doctor, and there was something about it that just didn't hold true. You know, there's a certain chemistry about people, and apparently I have a very strong chemistry about people, and I just could not feel the same about Major Harsh as Daddy did, and Dolly. Of course, Dolly was young, but I never felt like he did the best for Mama. Daddy thought he did. Everybody else accepted what he did. But anyway, his idea was to get Mama out of Jacksonville, to take her to this sanitarium in Nashville, Tennessee, where he was from, that knew something about it. And then after we got there, he made arrangements. The weather was so oppressing, of course, worse in Nashville, Tennessee. And our household was busy, and they were trying to save Mama and get her well, which of course they all, I'm sure, knew at the time it was impossible, so they'd keep her comfortable. Took her to Nashville on the train. I remember they took her to the train on a stretcher, and they had to put her through, which bothered me terribly, through one of the windows on the Pullman train. And of course she was in bed the whole trip, and then to this sanitarium, which was just an awful excuse for a hospital. That bothered me terribly, and we'd go visit her every day in Nashville. And I guess she was there about a week, and then it was so hot, just oppressingly hot. So why Walloon Lake, I have no idea, but he told Daddy that's where we needed to go. So Mamie and I went with Mama to Walloon Lake, and we were sort of in charge of doing what needed to be done. Now, Major Harsh and Miss Tenney, his wife, Miss Tenney we call her, handled things, you know, ran the household and all. And Mamie took over looking after Mama, administered the medicine and so forth, and was very strict with me, which I never got over in the time that I could be with Mama, because she was in full charge. But she was like that. She felt her superiority, and it was stronger. It became stronger and stronger as life dictated. You know, it was a very depressing time in my life to make that last journey. She died in Walloon Lake. I remember when Mamie came out of the room, had gone in the room and wouldn't let anybody else in there. I remember when she came out and said Mama had gone. And so they had to go through the mechanics, and it's all kind of hazy, but anyway, the mechanics, as you would have, in a strange place, and the funeral people coming in, and you know, all that. So back to Jacksonville, and there was a huge funeral. Mama's church had gotten so involved in politics, and the minister even ran for governor during a time. So Mama insisted that we just remove our membership from the Riverside Avenue Christian Church. So we started going with Daddy to the Riverside Baptist Church. So that is where her funeral was. It's a gorgeous big church. It's meant a lot in our lives. All the weddings were there. I remember Daddy wanted, and back then they brought the body, you know, after the body was dressed, they brought the body home, and they set up a portable casket in the room we were in yesterday, the little sunroom. And it bothered me terribly because they had a pink gown on Mama, and of course her color was blue. But we, you know, weren't asked. We could have told them that, but we were not in on any of the decisions. We were just children. So that bothered me. And of course Mama had such pretty hair. It was still a pretty color, even though it was drab looking because she had been through so much illness. It wasn't the way she wore her hair. So Daddy insisted we go in and see Mama in the, you know, march in the sunroom and see her. And I didn't want to. The only way I lived with it was she really wasn't my mother, because she wasn't in the right color and her hair wasn't fixed properly. So that's kind of the way you turn the page and live with it. But anyway, all I can remember was huge, and we all had to march down the aisle, and it's a huge church, a long aisle down to the altar in back of the casket, and then follow the casket. That was the custom. But and you could hear the sighs and the crying through the church. I mean, everybody was devastated. It really rocked the town, whether they knew her or not. They knew the situation, and 6 children. And, you know, I remember saying motherless children, you know. So we were marked, you know. And that was hard to live with. And, of course, and the word cancer, you didn't say that word out loud. It was an evil word. And so it was a secret we carried until it was accepted to say, because my grandmother had died with breast cancer, my aunt that I was named for, you know, after surgery, mastectomies, and then Mama, 3 of them right in rather close succession. And there were some hard years in there. But Aunt Lottie was wonderful, and she came and stayed with us until we got things in order. She was a great lady and lovely cook. And she and Uncle Will moved back to Oklahoma right soon after after we got the house established. And of course, that's when Hunky, who lived with them, came for dinner that night with everybody before Aunt Lottie and Uncle Will left. And of course, Hunky lost the house. He never had any money, and if he had any, he gave it away, or he spent it on a party. We found out later, many years later. And so there was no place for him, so he came to dinner and just stayed on, and we just adored him. And he was the gentle. Daddy was the tough and the disciplinarian, and Hunky was the gentle, singing. He had a beautiful voice. And every night after dinner, we'd go back to the music room, and he could play the piano. And Dolly learned, I mean, she could finger. And I took lessons, but I didn't like the piano, so I did very little piano playing. But I loved to sing. We all loved to sing. And so that, you know, that's how we had joy and happiness, and I'm sure that it pleased Daddy to think that, you know, that we could make a joyful noise. Well, I hesitate to use the word extravagant, except for her it was. It was for some occasion, I don't remember what, but anyway, all of these hand-painted dresses for Mamie and I. Now this would have been before, we were in grammar school age, and Mamie's taffeta was a gorgeous shade of sort of a soft yellow, and of course there were hand-painted butterflies all over it. And I got a sort of dusty blue, and I was so disappointed in mine because the artwork didn't show up on it. It was the butterfly. There was so much blue in the butterfly, and I was very disappointed. But anyway, they were very expensive, and I do remember those dresses. Also, she bought each of us a little fur neck piece, which was really just a big deal, really something special. And they were little neck pieces, little furs for children. So they were called, these little animals were called stone martens. Beautiful shade of soft brown, and the heads and the tails were on them. And you know, you could open the mouth and, you know, snap it across, and you could make a little choke out of it, or you could. And they were just lovely. We loved our little fur neck pieces, and they were very extravagant. And on another occasion, she had someone do embroidery. And I remember and I think that was for one of my recitals. But of course, when we dressed up, we dressed in matching, like I always dressed. Hazel and Man did matching clothes. Of course, it was easier that way to just, rather than figure out, I'd get one, see a dress that I liked, and I'd just get two of them, or I'd make one and be easier to do the second one. Well, when Mama was still alive, and she wanted, you know, to give us culture, and so Mamie was given art lessons, and Mamie was a wonderful, lovely artist. Could do portraits and, I mean, likenesses. I think probably that the little embroidered dresses were for one of my recitals, and maybe, but they were little baskets of flowers with ribbons, well, not embroidered ribbons all the way up the, and there are pictures of that somewhere, of those dresses. Maybe it shows me in that recital dress, in that little picture with the basket of flowers, from a boy that had a crush on me. I was all of probably 10 years old, and sent me a basket of flowers. So the picture was made with that basket of flowers. Well, Ms. Jones was the music teacher, and she was, you know, just not a first-class music teacher, but she was a fun music teacher. And so that's, you know, wasn't going to make a concert artist out of me, but teach me to play, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But I didn't like the piano, and I didn't like to practice or any of that, but now I love to sing. And the reward was, if I would do a good lesson, if I would practice and do my lesson, Miss Jones would then let me stay on 10 or 15 minutes longer, and she would play the piano and I would sing all of the favorite little songs of the time. And she had a son about a year, maybe 2 years older than I, and he had a lovely voice. Ben was his name, Ben Jones. And so he would sometimes wander in, or he'd be around and she'd call him to come in. So we did a lot of duets together. And of course she loved to give recitals. So I was often in a recital with, you know, piano, you had to do whatever, or sometimes we'd do duets, you know, there'd be another student. And then, but I always liked to sing, and Ben would be called into service to sing the whatever. And that was fun, and she developed, she organized a little group that was called the Be Natural Club. Of course, that's the musical term. I think Mama was still alive, but probably sick. And Miss Jones said, if you don't mind, I'm going to enter Betty in a contest in Orlando, and I'll make arrangements, gather them. And so I did compete, and you know, I got honorable mention. Of course, you had to sing their song, and you know, but I remember I was very nervous. I didn't particularly want to do that. That was sort of far afield in my book, because I didn't have aspirations to be at that time. You know, later on, I thought, wouldn't it be fun to be a you know, singer with an orchestra? But I got over that in a hurry. But he stopped all of that, what he considered foolishness. So the lessons, and Miss Jones wept and carried on, and but Mr. Chitty said that was not necessary. It was, you know, it was starting into the Depression, and it was frivolous. And that was one of my father's favorite words when morning part of something, he'd say, frolic, frolic, frolic. And that meant, it's too frivolous, we won't discuss it any further. Close the book. Frolic, frolic, frolic. So that was sort of the musical career. But then later, way down the line, when I started dating Henry Grumbles, and he was a delightful musician, fun, very attractive, and I went with him quite a bit. They were doing some local programs on the radio. This was radio, WJAX or whatever it was. And he got the word, and he said, let's go audition. So we did. And I was probably in high school, or maybe a little after, maybe it was after high school, maybe it was when I was home. And we went and auditioned, and we got selected. And so we had a weekly 30-minute radio time. And it was such fun, because we'd do you know, we'd practice and do all the popular songs, you know, I'm in the Mood for Love, and Blue Moon, and I think the program was called something about a boy and a girl, something simple like that. I think it's the way they referred to but anyway, it was fun, didn't last, maybe, you know, 6 months, maybe a year. But, and it's funny, because one night, Daddy happened to have, my sister somebody told me that Daddy happened to have, after listening to the news, the radio was still on, and he heard the program. And so whoever was in the room with him left it on him, and he didn't know why it was still on. And they said, well, that's Betty singing. And he was stunned, because I had not mentioned it. And he never mentioned it to me, and I never. It's just something we didn't discuss. But anyway, he did hear me one night, and he was a little surprised. I got along real good with boys. And of course now, as I told you, the house was always full of friends, and Arthur Junior's friends, and so friends would bring friends. And so it was just a sort of a natural next move that somebody would invite me out, or just want to just single me out and go to the walk to King Street to the drugstore, or if they had a car, go to the Colonnade, or go to a movie. So my dating sort of progressed from all these friends in and out of the house. And so I dated a good bit, and I dated earlier and more than my older sister. And of course, she always acted like, and I think it was her choice, but she kind of, I don't think she was really jealous, but it might have been a little bit of jealousy in there. And I loved to dance, and she would not dance. So of course we'd roll up the rug there, and Daddy didn't care. We'd roll up the rug there in the parlor, you know, that room we were in yesterday, and we'd turn on Victrola or something and dance. And, you know, just have fun. And Daddy even let me give several dances there where he would just disappear and let us take over the big living room and the kitchen. Because, of course, the kitchen dining room very much a part of it. And so I was a part of a little club, and we called it the Pleiades. And the Pleiades is a if you know astrology and how I happen to think of this, I don't know, but anyway, it's a group of stars, the Pleiades. You probably know. And I think there's 7 or 9, I don't know. And we had that number in our graph. So we were the Pleiades, and we would give these little gatherings. And I very often would offer to have it at our house, big room, and nobody worried about the floors. You know, so many households, you know, they worried about the floors being beautiful, that old thing. But Daddy, that was not a concern at our house. And then in college, I went to Florida State College for Women in Tallahassee for 1 year. And it was a 2-year course to be a teacher, but it was during the Depression, so I was lucky and Daddy did not believe in women being educated. He thought all a woman needed to do was be a good cook or know about the kitchen, but preferably be a good cook and know how to manage a household and take care of a family. And he felt like that's what a woman's role was all about. And that's the way, and so that seeped in to my being, and it didn't make me just want to be a career girl, make money, and blaze her own trail. So we were entirely different in disposition, desire, ambition, everything. And I dressed much more feminine than Mamie did. Mamie was well dressed but tailored. And I'd get a lot of hand-me-downs, and of course I was never comfortable in the hand-me-downs because, you know, but we wore hand-me-downs back in those, or at least that was my, you know, that's the way we did. And, but in college, my happiness was, or after college years really, because Tallahassee was so strict at that time, light fashion. So I never did much going off from school because it was too hard, you know, signed in and had to go either on the train or get a ride. And I was always cautioned about going with people that drank, the danger of it. And I didn't drink, you know, as I used to say, I was probably the cheapest date anybody ever had because all I wanted was a Coca-Cola. However, after I got married, I learned, and then I said, why didn't I learn to have a cocktail before dinner every night? I would not have been so harried. It wouldn't be such a distressing time to get through the dinner if I'd had a drink. However, that came later. But I dated a lot in those years and went to Gainesville almost every weekend, and Daddy allowed that because I stayed with Aunt Belle, my Smith's aunt, which was or with Aunt Georgia. We had 3 households of relatives in Gainesville. So, and I was always invited to stay at either Aunt Georgia's or Aunt Belle's. And I dated, and Belle didn't care if I stayed out all night. She didn't care when I came home. And of course, the boys would always come and meet her and to take me out. And so back in those days, you didn't go steady. You just somebody, and friends of friends, you know, or I'd go out with 2 or 3 of them. You know, whoever had a car, and it was just a very happy, fun. And we danced a lot, and they would drink, but I never had to drive home. There were times when I asked to sit at the wheel because I was a good driver, but of course, no date I ever had would allow it. You know, it was unmanly. So that was a very happy time, those years in Gainesville. And, you know, at the fraternity house, and my favorite places to be were the Beta House and the SAE House, where I had the most fun. I went to business school. Yeah, after the 1 year college was over and I was back home, and of course fell back into the routine of the household. And I wanted a job. I wanted some money of my own. I was never given an allowance or anything like that. So I took a business course, and then it was very interesting because this was still in the Depression, and I would go to connections of my father's, like the bank and food people and things like that, to apply for a secretarial job. I could type and take dictation. And they all had the same reaction when I would come and apply. They'd say, "You don't need a job. Mr. Chitty's daughter doesn't need a job." And I said, "Well, you know, I want some money of my own." I was turned down constantly because I was Mr. Chitty's daughter and didn't need a job. If there was a job to me, you know, I could understand that, but it really deflated me. So I finally, one of my school chums, a Jewish boy that had always liked me, and I'd gone sailing with him some. "Why don't you come talk to my dad?" Well, I went and talked to Mr. Klepper, and he said, "Oh, I'd love to have somebody come in half a day." So I started working for Mr. Klepper half a day, and it was a wholesale distributor for hotel china and glassware. Dishes, glasses, whatever, stuff for the bar, stuff for the kitchen, something. And you know, just an odd sort of, but huge building. I mean, it was a huge, you had an office in the little warehouse. And so and he was the dearest man. He was a gentleman and a scholar. This is probably the year before I got married, so I was probably 22, 21 and a half, 22. And I thoroughly enjoyed being down there. Earl Harvey was, let me think. He actually lived in the neighborhood, but I never knew him until Beefy Stark, who was one of Arthur Jr.'s good friends, that became my second husband. Earl was a good friend of Beefy's, and they lived in the same neighborhood. And Earl's father had died, and he had to leave college to come home to take over the family business, which was National Finance Company. And it was just a small company, but very acceptable. I needed at the time. It was a finance company. And they loaned on diamonds and jewelry and whatever. That's the way the people that were in hard times, that's what they did. And so he fell ill, and there was nobody else, so he went. And he was apparently a very good businessman, and he took care of 3 families. He took care of, I mean, this is, of course, when we got married, he took care of us, he took care of his stepmother and half-brother and their household, and then he took care of the aunt and uncle for whom he was named. So Earl had never acted like it was any hardship, but it definitely was for a young couple, so growing up. Anyway, to get back to meeting him, Beefy used to come and see, he loved coming to our house, like everybody else did. And he would come officially, start to see Arthur Jr. And he was in one of these groups of gatherings that Arthur Jr. was a part of. And his best friend was this Earl Harvey, who was a working guy. So he, you know, wasn't free to come and do all these kind of things. And so, as I remember, Beefy said, I'm going to ask, and he always called him Brother Squirrel. I'm going to invite Brother Squirrel. We all had nicknames. And we'll go to a movie, or we'll come by here. I want to bring him by here. Well, he brought Earl by, and Earl decided he kind of liked me, so he would start calling me for dates. In the meantime, Beefy, who was a wonderful golfer, and he became a protege of Mr. Cheek, and with his golf. Mr. Cheek loved to play golf, and so this is where the family connection sort of came in. So Mr. Cheek was delighted that I was dating, because I was dating both of them at the time, that I was dating Beefy. And Earl was sort of moving into the territory. Mr. Cheek would enter Beefy into these golf tournaments and bet on him. You know, I never did that side for years. And so he was very interested in Beefy's being, and Beefy became a tournament and a state champion as a result of this constant playing golf. And I would date him and go out to the golf and walk around while he was in a match or something. So I saw a good bit of both of them. And the three of us would go out together, go to dances together and things like that, you know, locally. So I was sort of caught in this for a little while. After I started going to work, I noticed every afternoon Earl would pass by that corner to pick up his car, a beautiful big Buick automobile. He kept it in a parking garage just beyond where I was working. And he'd sometimes stop there at the door. The first time or two, he'd stop at the door and speak to me and introduced him to Mr. Clapper. Well, after the first time or two, he said, why don't I just take you home? I would ride the bus, come on the bus. It came right there. And I was busing it to and from. And he said, I'll take you home. I just live on Oak Street, just a few blocks away. So he started taking me home, and he'd wait for me. Sometimes I wouldn't be through, and I'd be so nervous. He'd be standing out there. And I wouldn't want him to wait because I would be sort of embarrassed that this was developed. You know, what will Mr. Klepper think, having somebody stand at the door and wait for me to finish the day? But anyway, that's where the romance started. He picked me up every day and took me home. But as it turned out, Earl was ready to get married and Beefy was not. And I loved them both, you know, sort of serious to me, you know, dear. And I did, you know, I knew that I loved the guy, but I really didn't know that I was ready to get married. And so he kind of pushed this and said, I'd like to come speak to your dad. Earl came and talked to Daddy and asked if we could get married, and Daddy said yes. I was sort of stunned with all this. It happened very suddenly. And so we were married in March the 12th, I believe it was, 1940. 1940. So I was 23. In just a matter of a few weeks' time, I planned a church wedding, got our seamstress to make a dress, set up the reception, and about 200 people invited and came. I wrote out all the invitations, ordered and wrote out all the invitations, I wrote all the thank you notes. You know, I just am amazed knowing what I do as an adult of what you went through, because I had 2 daughters and a son, that it was really a monstrous task, but I didn't know it was that hard. And Daddy was very good about letting me, you know, order nice invitations. And he was determined that I would have a nice wedding, and that was nice. And he, you know, he saw me through it. So, and then Mamie, who couldn't believe that a younger sister would get married before she, and Robert Ballard, who was, I had even dated in Gainesville, some at the Beta House, and had introduced them actually. And he had, you know, gotten serious about her. And so she thought this was the time. So they got married 2 months after I did. But she would not be married in the church. She was married at home, and reception had about 50 or 75 people. And then she lived in Jacksonville, and he lived in Gainesville. You know, it was a modern marriage before it was before the modern day attitude. And then, so I remember late one afternoon, because Daddy didn't get home until late, 5:30 or 6. Earl drove up the driveway to the porte-cochere, and I don't know why, but I remember that Daddy went out got in the car with Earl, which is, I can't believe that's the way it happened, but that's the way my mind tells me that it did. And that he must have been there just at the moment Daddy was going into the house is all I can remember. I was there, but I don't remember the actual movement. But anyway, Daddy and Earl were in the car, and Earl had brought his statements from the bank and told Daddy he understood Daddy that well, because what mattered was, you know, that Earl was able to take care of me. So I was stunned when I later heard that he had brought his books, his ledger, whatever, and his bank statements to prove, not that he was a rich man, he wasn't, but he was running a healthy business. So he showed Daddy all that, and Daddy said it was all right. And then Earl brought me a beautiful diamond. Now, he had saved a diamond ever since he had been working up at the National Finances, you know, ever since he had been up there. He chose, and of course, these beautiful pieces of jewelry sifted through his office, his hands. And he had put aside this particular diamond, and it's a little less than 2 carats, about 1 carat and 3/4. And he had put it aside. And then he told me, he said, well, I've got a ring I want to bring you. And so that sounded sort of exciting. He said, do you want yellow gold or platinum? And I said, for the mounting, and I said, I like yellow gold. So he had this little design made and brought it to me. Of course, found out my ring, so I brought it to me one night. Beautiful little ring. I think Earl and I took 2 days, maybe 3. I guess it was 3 days. And we had rented a place. We lived at Neptune Beach, where Dolly's, in fact, just around the corner from where Dolly's place, the beach is. And so we lived down at, Earl and I rented this place, a darling little apartment at Neptune Beach. We used to live there almost a year. And in the meantime, he said, you know, and I had gotten pregnant within about 6 months. And so he thought he'd get a piece of property. And this piece of property was a prime parking place for dates. This was a little bluff, and there were no houses, you know, some little shanties down on the fishing, because fishermen lived on the river, on little dock houses, they called them. You know, there'd be cars out here parked because it was such a lovely spot. And so Earl found out it was for sale. It wasn't actually for sale, but he knew the couple that owned it, and he went to them. And I thought it was terribly expensive, but he didn't think so. He was handling it, and then bought the property, and then Uncle Earl, the uncle for whom he was named, he was an architect, and he said, I would like to design your home. So this and it's very well built, and it's always been a prime piece of property. Well, at the time of the war, we'd had Hazel, and married in 1940. Hazel was born in June, and married in, I guess, March of 1940. Hazel was born in June 41, and the war was building up. I don't remember all the dates. I'm just not good at dates, but I just had Mandy, and I remember Earl's, and I'd gotten back home, and I remember him coming in and saying, you know, I'm going to have to sign up. And I said, oh, Earl, you've got so many good reasons not to go in the war. You look after 3 families. You've got a business to run. And I said, Daddy's in the food business, and you can always switch over to the food industry, which automatically, I'll never forget, he said, I could not live with myself if I didn't go to war and do something to defend this country. So he signed up, and I realized how dependent I was for really the first time, that dependent. He joined the Navy, and he passed his tests and physicals and all, and he was made a lieutenant junior grade. He said he was the oldest junior grade in the Navy, which is not so. So he and a neighbor, a very good friend of his, joined the same day. Both went in the service and left on the train when Mandy was about less than 2 months old. Everything was rationed. Couldn't get gas enough to keep the car riding. So that's when I had a bicycle, and that's when I got the little attachment for the front and the back, and I bicycled in to have lunch and stuff and see Daddy and Hunky. I couldn't nurse her, or I was just too, life was too uneasy, it didn't work. So I did formula, bottles, and I had a terrible time trying to find carnation milk. But Daddy, being in the food business, when the case of carnation came in, I got a case of carnation. So it was, I mean, that's just a good example of how you deal with these things. About that time, and I don't know how I found Minnie, an older woman that said she would live here with me. We fixed up the garage room for her, for a maid's room. It was very adequate. And Minnie lived with me the 2 years that Earl was gone and helped me take care of these 2 babies. I immediately got over my fear because I'd never lived alone or had this much single responsibility, but you do what you have to do. And I became very religious. I read my Bible every night, and I thought, you know, God, you got to see us through this. I remember during the voting time, and I've always been taught, you know, do your part, vote. So I signed Minnie up, and of course, to vote over there. And she would always go in her little white uniform with a little starch cap. And I'll never forget the sort of a strange awe that went over the place, because we used to go to the drugstore, and we voted in the back of it. And when Minnie would go in to vote, and people would, you know, just stare at us, at me and at her. But Minnie would just march right on in. So you felt that Minnie was living not in her neighborhood. Every weekend I'd save enough gas so I could take her out to have the weekend with her daughter. So then I would have the 2 little girls for the weekend. This room was the den. Then later on down the road, when I had Bubba, it became his room with bunk beds and all. But during the war, we couldn't get oil, so I couldn't run our oil heater. So this house would get very cold. I had a fireplace in the living room and a fireplace here. Well, I couldn't close off that room, so the only sensible thing was to heat this room, which I did. I had a cot and two little cots and a baby bed in here. So we slept in here, and we lived in the kitchen. We could use the electric oven was our heat in the kitchen. I kept a playpen set up in the kitchen that Mandy stayed in. We had Minnie was a wonderful gardener. She put in a little garden there on the lower level in the waterfront. We grew vegetables, and then we raised chickens. And so we had chickens. I got a funny little chicken coop. Just bought a little portable chicken coop. I had I had an upstairs and a downstairs. It was adorable. There are probably pictures of it somewhere. And we raised chickens and had farm for our vegetables, and with Daddy's connection, the food business, and we survived. And Minnie was God sent. She was wonderful. She was wonderful, and stayed with me, and she got quite ill about the time Earl was returning, and she died almost immediately. Earl came home, and the first thing Mandy said was, "Who is that?" He'll never get over it. He walked in, this man walked in our house. And Mandy said, "Who is that?" She hadn't seen him. Oh, dear. So that's enough of that, but this little room was the way we kept warm and where we slept. When the Terrys came to Jacksonville for the wedding, and it was a Christmas, it was 27th to 28th of December, right after Christmas. And the Terrys stayed with, Gertrude thought they would like to stay with me. Well, now this was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, and I had been told that Mr. and Miss Terry slept in separate rooms, so that kind of sent me into a tailspin. So I thought, well, the only thing to do is for all of us. Now, I was pregnant with Bubba at the time, so there was just the 2 little girls, but I hadn't told anybody. And so Gertrude would, she would have, because I worked like crazy getting ready for all this. But anyway, I knew I was. And so the only thing to do is for the 4 of us to go back in that room, and I would fix this room for Mr. Terry and Pitty Pat in the other room with her own bathroom. When they came, so that was the setup, and it was feverish activity because there was the Christmas tree, and we'd just gotten through Christmas, and my brother and his 3 children had been in and out, and it was just wild. And I had called for Ruby, the original. You know all about Ruby. I had written to Ruby, always kept in touch with her. She lived in Perry, Florida, and I had written to her and said, "Will you come and help me get through Gertrude's wedding?" Gertrude was her baby. So she did come. We sent her the money, and she stayed in the room, which of course was empty by then. I couldn't have lived without her because she fixed our meals and kept the house in order for these house guests that I'd never met. And they came in in their big automobile, an elegant couple. And Miss Terry, just the perfect, beautiful lady that she was. And I wanted everything nice enough for Gertrude's in-laws. So, I pulled every plug at my disposal to do everything I could do. The night that they came in town, she went over to spend the evening at the Chitty house, and Mrs. Terry slipped down the steps at Daddy's house, broke her arm, and had to go to the hospital to emergency. Of course, Jack was the doctor, and he was here, and he handled that part. She came back, and of course, in those days, they put on those heavy casts. So here was to be the rehearsal and the wedding. I don't know just which days, but it was dangerously close. And well, we just had Christmas. They did not get here for Christmas Day. I do remember it was after Christmas. And she was all, so she had gotten these beautiful clothes for the rehearsal dinner and for the wedding. Well, I don't remember just exactly how we handled the rehearsal dinner. Gertrude will have to tell all that. But I remember getting her ready for the wedding because she was here with me. I remember helping get her in her little girdle, and I remember helping her dress, which was hard for her to accept. And of course, Mr. Terry was there helping too, fumbling, pathetically fumbling. So we had to get that dress so she could get in it. My next door neighbor, which we said a little earlier, knew this wonderful seamstress. Queen Bee said, I know she'll know what to do. I said, it's got to be made like a coat dress. So, with all that we were doing, we put Betty Pat the day before the wedding, found the dressmaker, I drove wherever it was, and she ripped the whole side of the dress and put hooks and eyes and around the cast. So we had to get her dressed that night, and I had to get dressed, and two little girls whose dresses I had made, and to practically, get them in the way they were supposed to look. They were the flower girls. And we had to hook her up. And she wore, after we got her dressed, she put it was a little short jacket, and she put it across her shoulder, so nobody ever knew that there was anything the matter. They just thought how stylish. It was sort of like wearing a lovely scarf. It was a beautiful, white, soft, and it just fit perfectly across her shoulder, whichever shoulder it was. That's the way we got ready and got how I got dressed, and got those two little girls dressed, and helped get Earl in a tuxedo. Because back in those days, you had to tie the tie. I'll never know. But we made it to the church on time, as the song goes. Down the road, after Earl had died, and Beefy was divorced at the time, he came, and of course he handled Earl's insurance, so of course he was in evidence, from the time Earl died. And so when he asked if we could get married, and it was a very hard decision, and he said, I'd like to bring you a ring, and I said, oh, Beefy, can't I continue to wear Earl's diamond? And he said, well, if we put it in a new mounting. I would say, that's fine. So on the second go-round, he put in a platinum mounting. The original yellow gold mounting, Lizzie wanted, when she got married for her, this is typical of our family. And when I married Beefy, he had a lot over in Deerwood, which is the other side of town, and I finally said, his son, because I had a stepson, Dad, you going to make Betty leave Ortega? I said, why don't we just stay here, Beefy? And he said, if you let me do it over, so it's my house, we can stay here. Now, the basic part of the house has never changed, but he doubled the size of the family room. He did the master bedroom suite, just went out, just extended the house, put in the pool. As far as he was concerned, it was then his house. Strangely enough, the house that's gone through many changes and many periods in life has never had to be altered, the original part of the house. I never traveled. I hardly went out of the city limits until this trip with Terry. The only family vacation that our family, Hazel, Manny, and Bubba had, about the summer after Gertrude. I think it was the summer after Gertrude. No, it would be later than that. In July, I think. We had never taken a really family vacation. We'd gone to the beach. I mean, that's what we did. we'd go to the beach and all had access to. We all loved the beach, or to somebody's lake place. But anyway, the Terrys invited the Harvey family to come and visit them at the cottage in Michigan. I was thrilled to death, and of course Earl said, I can't possibly leave. I mean, he was it. And but we talked about it, and I kept saying, this is an opportunity of a lifetime, which it was. And I guess it took us 2 weeks, because it was 3 nights going up and 3 nights coming back, so it had to be at least 2 weeks. We went up there, and we were barefoot kids. I mean, I was the kind of person that, I have to put this in, because we walk in the house and I kick off my shoes. I've done that for years. And Bubba was a year old, and he didn't have a pair of shoes, but I had these, because he was barefoot all the time, and I thought that was, you know, little sock feet, you know, in the wintertime. So I had these little leather boots that were like slippers. So I'd zip him in that, and that's really those were the only shoes that he had, and that's what we traveled with. And of course, he didn't wear them much, but when we got up there, I remember Miss Terry was horrified, because this little boy didn't even have shoes. He zipped on these little slippers, or he was barefoot. He didn't mind being a little cold. And of course, it's cold in Michigan, which I was not prepared to. I took bathing suits on, never once. Well, I put it on one time and nearly froze. That was the last of that. But we have never been, before or since, as royally treated as Mr. and Mrs. Terry treated us. They were wonderful. Every morning they would bring in fresh raspberries. And we went out a number of times, which is an unusual occasion for us to eat out that much at that time. And they would bring in cherry pies. And we'd go to the cherry hut. So but I wanted Cooper to know that our greatest family trip, probably our #1 outing at the time, was to visit his grandparents. And we called him Mr. Terry and Pitty Pat, who so royally treated us. And of course, Mr. Terry, many years later, when he was a widower and would travel in that, it was a big car for a while, and then he got the Dodge. Loved that Dodge. And with his driver, would go to Michigan. They'd always come and spend the first night on the road with me, wherever I was. And I would cook pot roast with potatoes and onions and a vegetable, which he didn't always eat, and plenty of toast. He loved toast or rolls. He was a starch man. And they would spend the night, and I remember seeing, when the car would drive up, I'd see Mr. Terry get out, and the 2 things he brought in every time was an electric blanket and a 150-watt bulb, because he would read every night before. So he would come in, and I would have the pot roast, and I would also have a drink for him. His Jim Beam, okay, was his drink, and I would fix a drink for whoever the driver was, whatever. And I know I found out many years later, I introduced, what was the driver that they all loved so? Curtis. And I didn't know that Curtis had never been, but he'd always have a drink. I never asked him, I just fixed it for him. He would drink it. So they'd just spend the night, and then I'd fix breakfast, lots of bacon, and he wanted it half cooked. He wanted it limp, and didn't want it crisp, and lots of toast. Mr. Terry ate, and I counted them. Now, this sounds like and if I'm a liar, you'll never know the difference anyway. But I counted 14 pieces of toast. Now, they weren't big slices. They were like so. I counted 14 pieces of toast. Now, breakfast was a prolonged meal that morning, but when Ruby was here and they were busy, they ate almost a whole loaf of bread. There are about 15 or 18 slices in the average, just regular size. He ate a loaf of bread and toast, 14 slices. Remarkable. So I think of these, you know how you'll just, when it's all sifted down, the funniest, the most amazing things will be foremost, will be, pop up. My trip that really meant the most to me was when I signed up for this art trip at Coma Gallery. I was a docent. I invited Hazel. She had recovered. About a year out, so we were still being careful. And I asked if she would like to go on this art trip, and it was spectacular, a spectacular trip. And our curator, who developed the trip and took about 20 of us that went, said, we're on this trip, we're going to go and see the artwork that will never be able to travel. That was the reason for this particular trip. So we went to these magnificent masterpieces in the world, in Europe, that will never, unless you take the chapel or the church, whatever. And I asked Tommy if she could go. Well, of course, he was stunned at the idea of her traveling and leaving Jacksonville. And the doctor that had dismissed her, but I mean, he was in Gainesville. And the first remark her mother-in-law said was, "Is Betty crazy to take Hazel out of this country?" So it was at that time that we did this incredible thing, and we made this trip, and it really changed her life, because she all of a sudden was open to this gorgeous world of travel and art. And of course, as you know, most of the masterpieces are religious art. So that was quite a trip. And then with the four sisters and Helen Lane, and Helen Lane planned the trip and was our guide and said, "I want you to go to all my favorite, that Ed and I have been many times, our favorite places. They're world travelers." That was another one. I guess going to Switzerland, to the Matterhorn. Now, we didn't climb the Matterhorn, but it was there in all of its glory, and we did the, what do you call, the gondolier? What do they call them? Okay. And which Mamie hated because she kept looking down. And I was like, I guess that, that was a real experience. But we went to all the fancy places. That was glorious. Daddy died, Earl died, Hunky died. That was 3 years in a row, and the business fell apart. And then Hazel getting sick and with surgery, and they didn't think she'd live. They thought if she did, she'd either be blind or paralyzed because of the nature of the surgery. Of course, she talks about it a lot. I don't talk about it very often. And then Mandy developed this awful cancer and had numerous surgeries. And those things have ruled my life, because I have been available. It is a tremendous responsibility to take care of a sick person when they're in their home or environment. And so it's through Daddy's illness, Hunky's illness, Earl's illness, Beefy's illness, and we took Beefy to Mayo. He died at Mayo in Rochester. And Gertrude's had serious illness. Dolly's had serious illness. Dolly lost a child. Those are but you don't dwell on that. You know they're there, and you are marked. And it's sobered me. I mean, I'm certainly more sober because of all this. But I can honestly say I haven't let it ruin my life because I've had a good life. And then these later years, Beefy's closest friend was J.E. Davis. And I have had the most fantastic world of traveling on a private plane on magnificent trips and all. As a single woman, I mean, they just included me with their house parties, which they did often. And so I've had so many phases. And Mr. Terry put it so plain, and he's the one that taught me, and he said that the way he did his memoirs, have you ever read Mr. Terry's memoirs? Well, they're quite remarkable. I have a copy somewhere. But Mr. Terry said, you know, I feel like I want to put on paper some of my experiences. Of course, he was in the First World War. And anyway, his life, and they traveled a great deal. And he said, I'm not going to try to do an autobiography. I'm going to do vignettes, little isolated parcels. So I thought, well, you know, and I love to write letters and stuff, so I thought, you know, I think I'll do that. So when I do these fantastic trips, not all of them, but some of the very special ones, like being on a private plane and going across the country and, you know, all this, going to the Fairmont and being a guest at Fairmont in San Francisco. Things like that I have written up. And I thought I'd lost the folder, but you know, I came across it recently. And I haven't reread it. I've got it there by my bed, but I haven't reread my stories yet. But I decided that's what I do, and maybe I will, again, right now that I can use my hands again, I've broken both of them at some time or other, but put down just stories, and it's almost easier and maybe more palatable. But no, I've probably got, I guess, about 6 or 8 that and I haven't done them the last few years because my hands have bothered me. But, well, you know, I've written up at least 3 trips to Europe that was special. Well, first of all, I never dreamed I would live to this age. Because I started off kind of sickly, and because of so many things that have happened that stretch you out, you know. But now at this stage of life, I think if we're honest, we think a lot about dying. Not that you're going to die, but how you're going to die. I would like to go to sleep. I would like to, and I make things like this in my prayers. I pray a lot. I don't do any heavy reading, but what I read, I feel like it's food for thought. I'm very selective. I'm getting very tired physically, which I resent. But that's the way it is. And I feel strongly that God makes us go, well, I feel like He's doing this to me, making me do all the things that are hardest for me to do, like giving up my hearing. I've had wonderful eyes, but they're getting a little weak. But what can I expect? I have loved the role that God has said I was having, and it's very average. It's being an average person, not too smart, average. Wonderful friends, wonderful family that I've appreciated and continue to have. And I'm just thankful to each one for the way I feel about them. Love. I'm bursting at this stage in my life. I'm really bursting with love for my family and my friends and for the life I've been granted. So I guess that's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, my dear, thank you for listening, I tell you. You know, and it's funny when I finish a conversation like this, I always wonder if I've said it like I felt it. You know, I'm never real sure what really comes out. I must tell you that we all kind of dreaded this because I didn't know what was going to be expected of us. And I didn't know that I was going to be able to remember what, and that sounds silly, I know, but what is important to remember.
Do you think you covered it? Did we miss
Scratch the
anything?
surface.
I was gonna
We've
say.
scratched the surface. Yeah.